Hi guys, it's Danny from Orchid Nature. Okay, so one of my viewers gave me a suggestion to make a sort of a video about different sections of the orchids and what they tell you if they are affected. So I'm gonna make this sort of a series videos and take each portion of the plant and tell you from what I know the signs to look out for to know if your orchids are healthy or if they're suffering, what makes them suffer, and so on. And today we're going to discuss about orchid roots and what do they tell you. Okay, so I think that orchid roots are one of the most important sections of the orchid, if you want, along with the crown and the stem of the orchid, because an orchid can withstand being left without foliage if it has good roots. It has a lot of chances to actually revive from that state, but if an orchid doesn't have any roots and is also dehydrated on the top, it has very few chances to recover, or if it's going to recover, it's going to take a whole lot of time. So orchid roots can be different depending on the orchid. Here I have a Phalaenopsis orchid roots that are growing healthy, and here I have an Oncidium orchid roots that I'll show you on different types. They are different not only because they don't look the same, but what you see in some roots may not apply to the roots of another orchid. So for example, I have a Phalaenopsis orchid, and everyone knows that when the roots are silvery or white, it is a sign that you should water your orchid. It's a sign that they are pretty dry and they could use a water. But in the case of Oncidiums, white roots are actually what you're looking for. Even after watering this type of orchid, you will not necessarily get green roots. So an Oncidium with white roots doesn't mean it needs a water like in the case of the Phalaenopsis. But they do share something common. Whenever there are green root tips growing, it means the orchid is doing quite well or is on the way to recovery. As you can see, both of these orchids have green root tips. This is a very good sign to know that your orchid is healthy or becoming healthy, or at least trying to survive, and that's what actually you're looking for in an orchid. So from this perspective, green root tips are a very good sign in both cases. Now these two orchids are actually healthy orchids. They're not dehydrated and they are producing a root system that can sustain the entire plant. But let's see some root affections that can make you worry. So for the main part, roots should be white or green depending on the orchid. It's never a good sign to see black patches or brown patches on your orchids. And I have an example here of an orchid which was potted in a very broken down medium and actually got a pretty bad case of burned roots. So as you can see along the root, there are all sorts of black patches. Now this means that the orchid's roots were burned either by decaying media, either by fertilizer. So if you see something like this on your orchid, it is definitely not a good sign, and it actually means you really should repot your orchid if you didn't repot it already. Always use fresh medium because it's not broken down and it's not going to be toxic, and unfortunately these roots will never look healthy again, but they can produce side shots which will be healthy. Sometimes roots may get a little brown because of the staining from the bark or the coconut husk. These are just tannins that tap into the spongy outside of the root. And it doesn't necessarily cause any harm, but you should be careful not to overload this pot with too many tannins because they tend to acidify the water, and orchids don't necessarily like too much of an acid water. But if you see something like this, but you also see growing root tips, it's not necessarily a reason for worry. Just try to rinse your potting media better, especially if you're using coconut husk. Some Oncidium roots might become green with time. This doesn't mean that the actual root is green, but there are all sorts of algae forming on the roots, and especially for those orchids that stay moist most of the time, like I have this Miltoniopsis here. Now again, this is pretty normal. It's not a reason for worrying. It doesn't mean that your orchid has green roots. It just means it accumulated just a few algae because you're keeping the orchid too moist. Now if you're dealing with an orchid that doesn't require moisture too long, this might be a reason to worry because it might mean you're keeping the orchid media way too moist for that particular orchid. So it just depends on the orchid. If your orchid's roots grow but then just stop at a point without any reason, it might mean that your orchid is lacking something. And in the case of my Miltoniopsis, because these roots actually grew in thin air, they're now receiving as much moisture as they would like. So their growing is really slow. They seem to stop all of the time. Doesn't mean that the orchid is sick. It has a lot of good roots in the media. It just means it needs more moisture. But this can happen in the pot as well. If you don't water your orchid regularly, or you're just not providing enough moisture, the root tips might actually start growing, then stop, and maybe then start growing again and stop again, and so on. So you should try to provide more moisture for your orchid. If you see your orchid has many brown roots like this, it doesn't have any growing root tips, green tips, then this is a reason for worry. This means the orchid somehow is not receiving enough air or is receiving too much moisture, and the roots are actually suffocating and dying. If you would unpot this orchid, you'd feel these roots are very, very mushy and they should be cut away. So if you see an orchid in this state, you really need to repot it, get rid of all this mushy roots, because all they will do is keep too much moisture, and repot your orchid into fresh media, give it good care, adequate moisture, and it should bounce back if the orchid has green leaves or good pseudobulbs. Some orchids, and especially Paphiopedilum orchids, naturally have brown roots. So if you see these type of brown roots with your Paphiopedilum, don't despair. It doesn't mean they're rotten. This is just the way this orchid is growing, and this is just the way the roots look like. You should definitely be able to see some yellow growing tips. This means this orchid is pretty healthy and the root system is evolving naturally. Sometimes you might deal with a pest infestation. So if the roots in your orchid pots seem to come to an end abruptly, just like they have been cut away, this might mean you have a snail infestation, and you really do need to address it straight away, because snails can do a lot of damage. Imagine that all the new root tips that are growing will get eaten away by snails. So something like this is definitely not a good sign. Also, on the surface roots, if you see any holes or roots that stop suddenly, this can mean you have a snail infestation as well. An orchid's roots don't necessarily need to grow all the time, so if you don't see any green root tips, it's not a reason for worry, especially if your orchid is in bloom. When it's in bloom, it's diverting too much energy towards the flowers, so the roots stop growing for a while. But they should pick up. As long as the roots look healthy, they don't look brown or mushy, they get green. In the case of Phalaenopsis, they get green when you water them. Everything is fine and you shouldn't worry. It's just the fact that the orchid is focused on producing beautiful flowers for you at the moment. Okay, so this has been the first part of What is Your Orchid Telling You? I hope you enjoyed it. If you have other questions for me, or I didn't mention something, please leave me a comment and I'll try to answer for you. And if you have other suggestions for videos for me, pop them in a comment and I'll try to get back to you. Also, don't forget we have an orchid giveaway for USA, and you have a link in the description to that if you want to participate. And yeah, visit orchidnature.com to get in touch with all our community. I'll see you next time. Thank you for joining. Bye.